I caught my neighbor stealing my electricity the way you catch a whisper you weren't meant to hear by accident. Half asleep. And then suddenly everything makes sense and nothing will ever be the same. It was a faint humming under the fence on a Tuesday night. The kind of sound you don't notice until it becomes a question. And then the question digs in. I followed it with a flashlight and a stupid amount of curiosity and found an orange extension cord disappearing under the cedar boards like some modern-day rope of secrecy. That cord led straight to Margot's porch light. And in that moment, the neighborhood that looked tidy and harmless from the street felt suddenly thin. Like a film you could peel back. My name's Evan Turner. And I'd been in my little Willow Ridge bungalow for 8 years, solar panels on the roof. Garden out back. The usual life of someone who thinks a smart thermostat is a personality trait. I'm not a hero. I'm not a saint. Just a guy who likes things that work when they're supposed to. Margot had lived next door for 3 years when we met. She was loud. Stylish in an exasperatingly precise way. The kind of person who treated the front yard like a stage. She volunteered at the community center. Chaired some HOA committees for a while. And smiled at people the way some people do with lone sincerity. You could call her neighborhood royalty, the sort who believed in rules when rules suited her. When I pulled that cord out from under the fence and saw the frayed ends, I felt something flip inside me, irritation layered with a dark little thrill. Who does this? I thought. Who borrows electricity like it's a cup of sugar? I didn't go the obvious route of filing a complaint immediately. I made a choice, one of those decisions that starts small and grows teeth. I unplugged the cord, reburied it under the boards like I was tucking in the scene for later, and went back inside as if nothing had happened. But I kept the flashlight imprint in my memory, and the image haunted mornings. A week later, my front door buzzed with a text. Margot, power went out. Your equipment out back. She'd put it plainly, as if the logistics of buried extension cords were an everyday civic courtesy. I could have called. Could have said, no. Check your breaker. I could have been reasonable. Instead, I put out a cheap camera I'd bought for package thieves and trained it at the fence. Because I wanted evidence. Maybe I liked the idea of catching her in the act, the thrill of moral certainty. Maybe I wanted her to squirm a little. The camera caught her at midnight. Gloves on. Elegant as always. Jamming the orange cord into a socket on her porch. She looked right at my fence light and smiled. Like she'd been taught to smile at cameras. That clip became everything. At the HOA meeting, I went with it. Because if there's one thing small towns love more than gossip, it's official validation. Margot showed up in her blazer and a face practiced for public performance. It was an accident, she said. Voice measured. Like a lawyer with a conscience. We had an outage. I was borrowing a neighbor's power for the fridge. The board. A nervous group of people who'd rather sign a landscape contract than look someone in the eye. Find her. They lectured about safety, codes, and liability. It felt, at the time, like justice. She paid the fine and wore it like a cape indignant, but still carrying on as if a slap in a municipal meeting couldn't touch the things she did privately. But this is where things get stupidly human and utterly predictable. Being right made me hungry to be right again. I started to think of the cord as proof of a larger moral slippage. And the next time she tried to borrow power, I wanted to humiliate her. So I wired a decoy, an old battery inverter I'd repurposed to look convincing, with a blinking green light and a fake surge protector. I wanted to catch her. But not just so the HOA would find her again, I wanted the neighborhood to see. I wanted the small, satisfying scolding. The night she came back, it was raining. She rooted under the fence like someone foraging for something they believed they were owed. She clipped the cord into my decoy and leaned back to smoke. Because Margot smoked when she wanted to look like a person with grit. The decoy gave a soft chirp and then a loud pop. A tiny theater of malfunction right there under the cedar. Margot dropped the cigarette, cursed, and raced up to her porch with a flashlight in one hand and rage in the other. Later, my neighbor Rosa, a spunky retired paramedic who liked to keep an eye on things, knocked on my door and said, "You're playing with fire, Evan." She meant it literally and morally. And she was right. The plug had incandescently melted. The insulation had started to burn. That event pulled the story into orbit. The city code inspector came with a pen and a serious face. Margot cooked up a story about emergency repairs and said she'd been wrong to use an extension cord, but she'd meant no real harm. The inspector left with a stack of forms, and the HOA moved to instruct Margot on proper procedure. It seemed contained, like a fever you put cold cloths on. But people in our neighborhood don't let things go. They feed on the drama of one small life intersecting with another, a kind of chemical reaction where dignity and spite combust. Margot's counter-moves were methodical, and in retrospect you could almost admire her resolve. She started using different outlets run-ins through the garage, a complicated rig under the detached shed, swapping orange cords for black ones with better insulation. She installed a generator in her garage and tried to feed it into the house in ways that made electricians wince. She wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was someone who'd found a hack and doubled down because the hack smoothed the discomfort of something else. Bills. Pride. Or maybe the feeling that she could bend rules and come out unscathed. When someone chooses frequency over legality, the reasons are often more human than villainous. I, meanwhile, escalated in my own way. I put up more cameras. I bought an energy monitor to track household draw. I even had Manny the electrician haul over a fancy meter and tell me, in the way electricians do, what was legal and what was dangerous. This will prove if she's backfeeding, Manny said, wiping his hands on a rag. He called it backfeeding like it was a disease, that terrible technical word wrapping itself around my moral certainties. After Manny left, I sat on my back steps drinking coffee as if this were a small farmyard dispute. And I told myself I'd stop once the truth was clear. And then one night, the situation spun out. Margot's generator illegally tied into her meter by someone in a hurry backfed into the grid. It created a surge that didn't just trip breakers. It traveled. And a small transformer by the community mailbox blew. That explosion was a sound you don't forget. Like thunder chiseled from metal. Windows shook. Neighbors came out in robes and slippers. Phone flashlights bobbing like fireflies. Firefighters arrived and rolled hoses. The transformer's insulation had vaporized. The community had to stop. Suddenly. Because a physical thing had happened, it was no longer just a whisper of stolen power. It was smoke and melted plastic and the taste of electricity in the air. Margot's house caught damage that night. Not a cinematic inferno, but enough, scorched siding. A singed corner of the deck. The generator blackened and useless. She was arrested on a related charge the following morning for reckless wiring. She spent a night in county lockup and told anyone who would listen that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. An overreaction by a town that didn't like her voice. The HOA board called an emergency session. People took sides like choosing teams at school. Some talked about safety and code. Some, the ones who'd heard her speak at the community center and had once shared internship tips over coffee, said she was being scapegoated. Sitting in my kitchen that morning, watching news vans pass by like beetles, I felt an odd pull, a mixture of triumph and a cold, anxious guilt. I had wanted her held to account. I had wanted to be right. But rightness, when pressed like that, has weight. It settles into you. I started to see how easy it had been to reduce a person to a clip, the midnight smear of orange cord and gloves. A 30-second moral cartoon where the complexities of her life were flattened into a single act. What Margot had told people in quieter moments trickled out. She'd been laid off twice in the last 5 years. Her sister had medical bills that stacked like nervous cards. And the annoyance at utility companies for billing for phantom charges had turned into a stubbornness to opt out. She'd been told to be practical and be thrifty and smile through it. She'd taken that advice and tacked it into something dangerous, unauthorized hardware. A generator repurposed. Improvisation that feels like survival to the person improvising. That knowledge didn't make her right in the eyes of the law. It did, though, complicate the picture. The courtroom phase, because of course it reached it, was a parade of experts and testimony. Many testified about code and risk, about what backfeeding does to transformers and why it can kill linemen. Rosa testified quietly about mental health resources and how neighbors could help instead of tattle. Members of the HOA testified about complaints and fines. Margot gave a statement about desperation and community failures and how judgment is easy when it's someone else's life. The judge, a man who seemed weighted by the gravity of dealing with so many small-town betrayals, handed down penalties. And Margot was ordered to make repairs and attend a community safety class. The legal chapter closed with the slow finality of municipal paperwork. And yet, even after the official ink dried, something about the way we had all acted left me restless. There's this quiet cruelty in modern civility, the way a camera clip can eclipse a person. How digital proof makes us believe we can apply moral labeling easily. I started to notice things about myself, the smugness of being the person who called the shots. The thrill at making a righteous case in front of the board. I started to think about how I had allowed my sense of order to harden into accusation. I'd stopped asking whether there were other ways to resolve the problem. I'd stopped wondering if we could have offered Margot different options, a payment plan, community assistance, a mediator. That's the midpoint, where the hero or the person who thinks they're the hero looks in the mirror and doesn't like the face reflected back. For me, that was an afternoons-long conversation with Rosa that started because she dropped off lemon bars and stayed to drink my bad coffee. You didn't catch her to save anyone, Evan, she said. And then she let the sentence hang. You caught her to win. I bristled because it was true. And then I sat with the feeling that I'd allowed a moral victory to justify harm. It's an ugly, honest place to be. So I did something clumsy and human. I went to her house with a broom and the intention to ask if she wanted help. I stood on her porch that afternoon and knocked. Margot opened the door like she was holding all the dignities of a lifetime in her hands. For a moment, we measured each other, two people who had been reduced to headlines and gossipy conversation. I said, "Look, I'm sorry about the cameras. I didn't think it through." She didn't forgive me immediately. She studied me like a person whose trust had been tested and found wanting. Then, in the way people do when the neighborhood turns on you, she asked a question that cut clear. Are you here to help? Or to gloat? I answered poorly. Both, I said, because it was partly true. We talked for hours anyway. About the petty things and the heavy ones. She told me about a heating bill that spiked in a storm because the energy company misread a meter. About the time she'd been told to be resilient, like it was a personality trait. She told me about pride and shame crashing together. I told her, clumsily, about how the hum under the fence had made me paranoid. We argued. We laughed. We shared stories that made us human and not just characters in some HOA morality play. I promised to help with the repairs. Genuinely. Because I wanted to ease what I'd participated in creating. She accepted the offer without ceremony. Community aid is messy. We organized a small fundraiser among neighbors who were willing. Not everyone wanted to chip in. Some felt Margot was beyond help. But Rosa worked the lines and found people who remembered that once you're in a hole, a ladder might do more than turning someone into a cautionary tale. Manny rewired the generator properly. And we replaced the scary jury-rig connections with an electrician-approved setup. Margot took the safety class, which made her furious in private and grateful in public. The neighborhood patched the broken siding and planted a shrub where the scorched wood had been. Like a faint, slow apology. Even with repairs. Though, the main conflict didn't evaporate. People remembered. In the coffee shop. At the farmer's market. At the school pickup lane. The story lived on in versions and exaggerations and the occasional false claim. The HOA's minutes still bore mention of fines and a suggestion for a neighborhood watch on utilities, a phrase that felt like a hat the town kept passing around. Margot kept her head down and then raised it again. Adapting like people do when you give them one option, fight or fold. She chose fight, but in a different register, not with illegal wiring, but with advocacy. She started attending city council meetings, speaking about energy assistance and the follies of a system that made survival look illegal. Me. I started a different kind of project, a registry of community resources for utility assistance and a meet and help list for those who needed small repairs and couldn't afford them. I advertised it on a community board with simple, almost patronizing language about neighborliness. And then I watched to see who would use it. The first call came from an elderly man down the street whose heat went out in January. The second was from a single mother with a broken dryer. It wasn't heroic. It was the kind of tedious work that stops people from becoming case studies. It didn't scrub the moral stain off what had happened. It offered, instead, a single, small alternative to escalation. There's an odd way consequences double back. Margot's reputation never fully reset. But people also started to see that the world we live in pushes people into corners. Some neighbors apologized privately. Others complained the entire time, calling what we did unnecessary. That tension, the coexisting empathy and judgment, is the engine of small communities. It's what makes for good gossip and bad policy. The most cinematic scene came months later. But it was quieter. Not like a thunderclap. A storm rolled through. The kind that throws branches like overripe fruit. The power blinked. Then went. In the dark, patches of the neighborhood looked like a flipped-out galaxy. I went outside and saw Margot hauling an old gas lamp onto her porch. She caught me watching and lifted the lamp. "You got a charger?" she asked. I smiled and offered the battery bank I'd bought after the transformer incident, one that was installed legally and safely, with cords hidden and covers on. She took it and handed me the lamp, like a trade between two people who'd been through a trial together. We stood there in the wind and the rain, two silhouettes under the same weak, temporary light. And for a moment it felt like truce. Not because we'd won, but because we'd chosen not to keep fighting. That scene, the uncomplicated sharing of light, felt cinematic only because life rarely stages its reconciliations. They're small and inelegant and utterly human. It didn't clear guilt or rewrite the past. It simply suggested something the law rarely measures: the capacity to repair. The story ends in a way that keeps folks talking, not a tidy resolution, but a kind of moral unresolvedness. Margot moved 2 years later, and the house was sold. People speculated endlessly about why: financial strain, burnout, a desire to start over somewhere without familiar eyes. A few months after the new owners moved in, somebody found the buried orange cord again when they did landscaping. It was frayed and brittle, like an artifact. They pulled it up and tossed it in a bin. And for a while it was just trash. But the neighborhood conversations never stopped. Was Margot a thief? A survivor? An annoyance? A martyr? Did we do the right thing by exposing her? Or should we have offered help sooner? My registry kept ticking. Rose's volunteer group expanded. The HOA instituted a referral program for residents facing utility hardship. The town added a program for emergency energy assistance. But not before a lot of people asked questions about who's responsible and who should pay. People who remembered the smell of melted insulation and the sound of the transformer explosion had one position. People who'd heard Margot's quieter stories had another. Both were true in their own ways. And neither alone told the whole story. I tell it now because the little moment I started with, the hum beneath the fence, taught me something important and stubborn: that justice without charity is brittle. And charity without accountability is a risk. The trick is balancing them, which is harder than it looks when you're standing on a porch with someone you've judged and judged yourself for judging. The escalation was avoidable in many small ways, but it was also propelled by things beyond any one neighbor's control: energy costs, social shame, the way we ration dignity. If there's an image I hope you take away, it's a small one: Margot in the rain, the lamp between us, the legitimate battery bank humming like a promise. It's not a final image. It's a fragment, and fragments are what stories of communities really are: pieces of people trying and failing, and sometimes, with great effort, forgiving. So tell me, what side are you on? Was I right to document and expose? Or should I have knocked first and offered help? Was Margot a criminal? Or was she a neighbor pushed past ordinary options? Drop a comment. Tell me where you stand. And if you've ever had to balance being right with being kind. If this stirred something: anger, sympathy, clarity, share it. If you liked how this was told, subscribe for more stories where the stakes are small on paper but big in the porch light. And if you've got a neighborhood story of your own about power, pride, or people, put it in the comments. There's always room for one more perspective in the conversation.